Hello everyone, Mancha here, and welcome once again to the YouTube channel. Today we want to be looking at side effects in React. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So what are side effects? For us to understand side effects better, we want to first look at what React is, and that will give us much needed insights to understanding side effects. So React is a free and open source JavaScript library for building user interfaces based on components. So React follows a component-based architecture. Now, what are these components? Components, where you can refer them to like functional components, right? They're functions. They take in props and states, and then they return React elements which control what is to be rendered. So the user interface. So we're primarily concerned with the rendering. You understand? Primarily concerned with that. And naturally, once you are building a real life application, we're going to be concerned with things that are outside the scope of rendering components, rendering the user interface, working with the virtual DOM. We're going to be concerned with things that involve interaction with real life, the external world, right? And so that is where side effects come in. Side effects involve us in interacting with the external world outside the scope of React. So doing stuff like data fetching, setting up a subscription, manually changing the DOM. You understand? These are examples of side effects, and you may not be used to calling these side effects or effects, but you've probably done them at one point or another. So how do we handle side effects in React? In React, we handle side effects using a hook called the useEffect hook. This is provided by React for us to be able to handle these side effects because it's essential that we can interact with the external world within the context of our application. So this is just a basic syntax of how the useEffect looks. This is how it comes. You pass in two arguments. The first argument is the callback function. The second argument is the dependency array. You could choose to also omit this dependency array as well. So let's look at some example of side effects. The first one we're going to look at is manipulating the DOM. Say for example, whenever the component mounts, whenever the initial render is done, or whatever dependencies change, we could choose to manually manipulate the DOM, change the title to this, for example. And then let's say whenever the component unmounts, whenever the dependencies change, we could choose to run a cleanup function. We could just return this function. Now this will execute every time to revert the title to this. So that's one example of a side effect. Another example is like working with a set interval. So let's say we want to execute something periodically at set intervals. We could choose to perform some sort of action at maybe after every second, so to keep on working repeatedly. And then let's say we want to clean this up. That is what cleanup functions help us to do, because we need to clean up sometimes the side effects, the resources that are no longer in use. You say for example this scenario, we need to clear out the interval once the component mounts or when the dependencies change. You understand? Because if we don't do this, it might cause a memory leak. So when you might have a situation whereby even though the component mounts, the set interval keeps triggering. You understand? The action that we performed before keeps triggering even though the components are mounted. So we want to avoid scenarios like that, hence we use the cleanup function to clear the interval. This is another scenario as well. You might want to check if the user is authenticated whenever the component mounts, whenever the dependency changes. We also could work with local storage, right, using the useEffect. So in this case, we're setting a key, let's say any key, whatever. This is just an example to a certain value, right? So whenever the initial render is done, whenever the component mounts, this will trigger. Now for WebSockets, we could choose to make a new connection. Whenever the components mounts, dependencies change, you get the gist, right? And then whenever the component mounts, whenever dependencies change, we could choose to close that socket connection. Now this is one I find myself doing quite often, like fetching data, making API calls to an external API. So we have this asynchronous function that we could use to fetch data from the API, right? And then we could use to set the data to the result of data we got from the API. So now there are cases where, we've already seen examples, but we could have a useEffect which has no second argument. Let's look at an example. So this is an example of a useEffect with no second argument. Now, no second argument. What does this mean? It means that the callback function will get triggered every single time the component renders. So it's not just going to trigger on the initial render or when the component mounts. Every time the state changes, it will trigger, it causes a render, and then the use effect will be the callback function within the context of the use effect will get triggered. Now we need to be very careful with this, because if you don't do this properly, let's say you have a scenario where you want a callback function to execute every single time the component is rendered. If you don't do this properly, you might end up with a situation whereby you have infinite rendering or an infinite loop. Now, this is something that needs to be avoided. Let's say one scenario where you can cause this is, let's say you have a use effect and a callback function, and in the context of that callback function, you're doing something that changes the state. What happens is, if the component mounts or if the component renders, the state will get updated, and that will cause it to render. And once it renders, it will trigger the callback function again. So this will make it run infinitely. So you want to avoid scenarios like that. Then we're looking at the use effect with no dependencies. So let's say one which has an empty array. What does this imply? It implies that whenever the component mounts, right, this will run on the initial render. So just on the initial render, once the component mounts. And then we have a cleanup function here as well. If we want to perform an action whenever the component mounts, we can do that here. And then lastly, we want to look at a use effect which has dependencies. So we want to be able to manage scenarios where whenever dependencies change, then we execute something. So let's say we have data here which we're managing, right? So whenever the data changes, use effect will trigger. Then we also have a cleanup function which will trigger whenever data changes as well. So this is just the general gist of use effects. Hope you learned something. Hope you get some much needed insight. If you did, please like, comment, and share. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.